cop finds a baby abandoned in a trash heap and saves her life. Years later, she returns, not just to say thank you, but to show him how much she's changed. Together, they build a program that helps others like her find hope and strength. This powerful story of second chances, redemption, and the impact one person can have on another will leave you inspired and moved. When Officer James walked down the alley, his mind was on his shift. Routine, uneventful, just another night in the city. He had been on the force for over a decade, and the usual nighttime calls didn't stir much in him anymore. But as he passed the old dumpster behind the abandoned warehouse, a sound stopped him. It was soft, faint, almost like a whimper. For a split second, he thought it was a stray dog, maybe even a raccoon. But when he took another step closer, his heart skipped a beat. The faint cry grew louder, more desperate, and it wasn't coming from any animal. It was a baby's cry. Without thinking, he rushed to the dumpster, scanning the area in panic. There, tucked away in a pile of trash, was a small bundle, no bigger than a backpack. His pulse quickened as he carefully unwrapped the bundle, revealing the fragile, helpless face of an infant. Her tiny hands reached up, her cries muffled in the thick night air. He couldn't fathom how a baby had ended up in such a horrific place. He quickly called for backup, his voice shaking as he tried to keep calm. "I need an ambulance now. There's a baby. She's in the trash." The dispatcher's voice was muffled through the static, but James could barely hear it. All he could focus on was the baby, her eyes wide and full of fear. He held her close, whispering reassuring words, even though he wasn't sure if he even believed them himself. Minutes felt like hours as he waited for the paramedics to arrive. He knew he couldn't stay here forever. He needed to get her out of this hellish place. When the paramedics finally pulled up, they rushed to his side, but James couldn't help but notice how one of them hesitated when they saw the baby. The small, dirty face, one that had clearly seen far too much in such a short time, was not what anyone expected to find in a world so busy with its own problems. But there she was, alive, against all odds. As the paramedics took over, James stepped back, still clutching the image of the infant in his mind. How could anyone do something like this? What kind of world was this, where a child was thrown away like a piece of trash? He couldn't let go of the baby's eyes, the way they looked at him, as though pleading for someone, anyone, to care. He would never forget that moment. Years passed, and James went on with his life, continuing to serve his community, but he couldn't forget her. The little girl who had been left for dead, the one whose cries had stopped his world that night. He never found out who abandoned her, nor did he expect to. The case went cold, as so many did, and life moved on. But the city never forgot, and neither did he. Then, one evening, James was called to a routine traffic stop. As he stepped out of his car, he was momentarily distracted by a woman standing on the corner, her face familiar in some way. He couldn't place it at first, but something about her struck him. She was standing near a group of teenagers, and as he got closer, he realized why she seemed so familiar. It was her, the same child, the same girl he had found all those years ago, the baby he had saved. She was no longer a baby. She had grown into a young woman, her features now unmistakable. His heart nearly stopped when their eyes met. She looked at him, recognition flickering in her eyes, and then, almost as if by instinct, she ran toward him. He didn't know what to expect, but he sure didn't expect what happened next. "Officer James," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I've been looking for you." It took a moment for the words to sink in. The girl he had saved was standing before him, an adult now, but still carrying that same look, the one that haunted him for years. But this time, it wasn't fear in her eyes. It was gratitude. "I never forgot you," she continued, her voice trembling. "You saved my life. And I need you to know. You were the reason I survived. I'm here because of you." James felt a lump form in his throat. How could this be? How had she found him after all these years? What could he possibly say to make this moment right? But she wasn't done yet. She stepped closer, her eyes filled with determination. "I don't want to just say thank you," she said softly. "I want to show you who I've become. I want you to see the person you saved. I've become someone I think you'd be proud of." Tears welled up in his eyes as he looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time he realized the depth of the impact he had made on her life. The small, helpless child had grown into someone strong, someone resilient. And in that moment, James realized that saving her all those years ago had meant more than he could ever understand. It wasn't just a job. It wasn't just another night on the beat. It was the moment that had changed both their lives forever. She wasn't just a girl he had found in the trash. She was a living testament to the difference one person, one action, could make. And as they stood there, on that street corner, James knew that no matter what happened next, he had done something that mattered. He had made a difference. James looked at her, his mind racing, unsure of what to say next. His eyes traced her features, the way she stood, confident but hesitant, the soft curve of her lips that hadn't been there when she was just a baby. There was a strength in her now, a resilience he could see in every move she made, every word she spoke. He couldn't help but feel a wave of pride surge through him, even though he hadn't been part of her life in years. Do you remember anything from back then?" he asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. He knew it wasn't a fair question. How could she? She was just a baby. But part of him wanted to know if she could recall anything, the feel of his arms around her, the fear in her eyes as he held her close, the desperation of that night. She shook her head, her eyes softening as she looked down at the ground for a moment. "I don't remember much," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know you saved me, and that's something I've carried with me every day of my life." His heart tightened at the simplicity of her words. It was as if those few sentences held everything she needed to say, everything that had been left unsaid all these years. He wasn't sure how he had made it through his own life without knowing the impact of that one decision, but hearing her speak now, he realized just how much it had meant. For a moment they stood there, the world rushing by around them, but in that moment it felt like time had stopped. The bustling city, the noise of traffic, the people rushing by, everything faded away. It was just the two of them, standing there together, two strangers connected by the most extraordinary of circumstances. She cleared her throat and smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I've been through a lot, you know," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "But I'm here. I'm still standing. I've made it." James could see the weight in her words, the years of hardship that had shaped her into the person she was now. He didn't need her to say anything more. Her eyes spoke louder than any words ever could. "I'm proud of you," he said, the words coming out before he could even think. It felt right to say them. It felt true. She smiled again, this time brighter, her whole face lighting up. "Thank you," she whispered, almost as if she hadn't heard those words in a long time. And for a brief moment James saw the little girl from that night again, the one who had been lost, abandoned and forgotten. But she was no longer that helpless child. She was strong, capable, and full of life. Before James could say anything else, she stepped forward, her hand reaching out towards him. "I want you to meet someone," she said, her voice firm with purpose. "Someone who's very important to me." James frowned, unsure of where this was going. "Who?" he asked, His curiosity piqued. Without another word, she motioned for him to follow her. They walked together down the street, past the busy intersections, until they reached a small cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The kind of place most people would pass by without giving it a second glance. But to her, this was home. Inside, a young man sat at a table near the window, his eyes glued to his phone. He looked up when he saw them, his expression softening into a smile as she approached. "Hey," he said, standing up to greet her. But when he saw James, his smile faltered for just a moment. "This is Officer James," she said, her voice filled with pride. "The man who saved me. He's the reason I'm here." The young man stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say, before stepping forward and extending his hand. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice full of gratitude. "I don't know what else to say, but thank you." James shook his hand, feeling a strange sense of gratitude in return. Here was someone who had been part of her life, someone who had helped her along the way, someone who had watched her grow into the person she was today. He realized, in that moment, that he didn't need to have been there for her every step of the way. The fact that she had made it this far, that was enough. "I'm just glad I could help," James said, his voice thick with emotion. They spent the next few hours talking, sharing stories and memories, and James began to understand just how much this girl had been through. She had fought for every step she had taken, had climbed every mountain in her way, and had done it all with a strength that was hard to ignore. The woman in front of him wasn't just the baby he had saved all those years ago. She was someone extraordinary. As the evening wore on, James felt something stir within him. It wasn't just pride anymore. It was awe. He had been part of a story that had unfolded in ways he could never have imagined. A story of survival, of growth, of redemption. Before he left, the girl, now a young woman, looked at him one last time. "I'll never forget what you did for me," she said, her voice steady and full of conviction. "And I promise, I'll keep going. I'll keep living. Because you showed me that I can." James stood there for a moment, unsure of how to respond. But then, as if the words had been there all along, he said simply, "I believe in you." And with that, he turned and walked away, knowing that his life had been forever changed by the little girl he had saved all those years ago. The world had a way of bringing people together in the most unexpected ways, and James had been part of a story that was bigger than anything he could have ever imagined. The story of a life saved, and a life that would never be the same again. James couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within him that night. The moment he'd met her again, after all these years, had been more than just a reunion. It had been a reckoning. The little girl he had saved had grown into someone so strong, someone whose life had been shaped by the darkness she'd endured, and yet, here she was, standing before him, glowing with hope. The weight of it all settled heavily in his chest. How could he have known that his small act of kindness, just doing his job, would lead to something so much bigger? As the days passed, James found himself thinking about her more and more. He'd saved a life, yes, but now he was curious about the path she'd walked to get to this point. What had it been like for her? What struggles had she faced to get here? What did her life look like now? One evening, after a long shift, he found himself sitting alone in his car, parked in front of the same cafe where he had met her. He hadn't planned to come here, but something about the place called to him. The city felt colder tonight, quieter than usual. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself and sat there for a while, watching the world go by. The thought of her strength, filled him, making it hard to sit still. He felt like he had missed something, something that was right there in front of him, but he didn't know what it was. He had to see her again. Without thinking twice, he got out of the car and made his way inside the cafe. As soon as he stepped in, The warm, familiar scent of coffee wrapped around him, easing the tightness in his chest. The place was quiet tonight, with only a few people scattered in the dimly lit booths. There, at a corner table, sat the girl, no longer a girl, but a young woman. Her back was to him, but James knew it was her before she even turned around. Her eyes found him as soon as he approached. A smile spread across her face, one that reached all the way to her eyes, and James could feel it, her warmth, her confidence. It was the smile of someone who had found their footing, someone who had survived the darkest parts of life. And in that moment, he realized just how much it meant to him to see her this way. She motioned for him to sit down. "I've been thinking about you," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "I know I haven't said this enough, but I want you to know that I'm okay. You don't have to worry about me." James took a seat, the weight of her words sinking into him. "I'm not worried about you," he said, his voice steady but soft. "I'm proud of you." She laughed lightly, her gaze softening. "Proud? You don't even know me that well." "I know you more than you think," James said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He could feel it, the truth in those words. He knew her story without even knowing all the details. He knew what it meant to survive, to keep going, to fight for your place in this world when everything else seems to be falling apart. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet hum of the cafe surrounding them. It wasn't uncomfortable, but rather peaceful. It was as if the world outside had paused just for them. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," she said, breaking the silence. "About what comes next, you know. I want to give back somehow. I want to do something that matters, like you did for me." James raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I feel like I need to help people. Like, if I can get through what I did, then I can help others who are going through their own battles. I've been working at a shelter, and I've been thinking about going back to school, maybe studying psychology or social work. I don't know. It's just an idea." James nodded slowly, impressed by her strength. "I think that sounds like a great idea. I'm scared, though," she confessed, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "What if I fail? What if I try, and I can't make a difference?" James leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "You won't fail. You're stronger than you think. And even if you stumble, it's okay. You just get back up. And you keep going." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if she was looking for something deeper, something more. "You really believe that?" He smiled, a genuine, knowing smile. "I have to. I've seen you make it this far. I know you can go even further." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I don't want to be the person who was abandoned, the one no one wanted. I don't want to be defined by what happened to me." James felt a lump rise in his throat. He had no idea how hard it must have been for her, growing up with that weight, that constant reminder of being unwanted. But as he looked at her, he realized that she wasn't defined by that. She had become someone new, someone incredible, and that was all that mattered. "You are not defined by your past," he said, his voice firm. "You are who you choose to be. And I see someone who's going to make an incredible difference in this world. Someone who's going to change lives. And I think it starts with you, believing in yourself." She smiled, her face lighting up in a way that made James' heart swell. "Thank you," she whispered, as if those words meant everything to her. And in that moment, James realized something else, that his job as a cop, as someone who had saved lives, wasn't just about what he did in the line of duty. It was about the lives he touched, the people he helped, and the way they carried that kindness forward. As they sat there, the conversation shifting to other things, James knew this was the start of something new. For both of them. They had both been changed by that one night, that one act of kindness. And now, they were both moving forward, toward something greater than themselves. Something that could make a difference. And for James, that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and James found himself thinking about that conversation more than he expected. It wasn't just the girl he had saved all those years ago that lingered in his mind. It was what she had said, how determined she seemed to change the world in her own way. He wasn't sure if she fully understood how extraordinary she was, how much of a force she had become. But he saw it, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the cusp of something big. He couldn't help but wonder, could he be a part of that journey? Could his presence in her life, even in this small way, help her make her mark? He didn't know, but he wasn't going to sit by and just watch it unfold from a distance. No. He had made a choice once to save her life, and now he realized that wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. One afternoon, as he was leaving the station after a long shift, his phone buzzed. It was a text from her. "Can we meet? I need to tell you something." A mix of curiosity and nerves filled his chest. What did she need to tell him? He knew she had been talking about giving back, about finding a way to make a difference in the world. Had something changed? Was she unsure? He couldn't stop himself from texting back, of course. "Where?" The message came through quickly. "Cafe again. Same time." He didn't hesitate. He found himself back at the cafe, the one where they'd met again, as if fate had somehow woven their lives back together in this place. When he walked inside, he saw her right away. She was sitting in the same booth, but something was different. There was a new kind of energy around her, a confidence that hadn't been there before. She wasn't just waiting for him, she was waiting for something. He could sense it. "Hey," she greeted him with a bright smile, but he could tell there was more to it. Something important was coming. He sat down across from her, watching her closely. "What's going on?" he asked gently, already knowing there was something serious weighing on her. She had that look again, the one that said she had made a decision, and it wasn't going to be easy. She took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I've decided. I want to start a program. For kids who don't have anyone. Like I didn't." Her voice wavered slightly, but her eyes were steady, filled with resolve. "I want to give them what I never had. A chance." James leaned forward, feeling a surge of pride and admiration for her. He could see how deeply this mattered to her, how personal it was. This wasn't just some passing idea. This was her calling. "That sounds incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I know it's going to take a lot of work. What do you need?" She smiled, that familiar warmth returning. "I need someone to help me. Someone who knows the ropes. Someone who can guide me. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I think it should be you." James blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected that. He had spent so many years doing his job, protecting, serving, and keeping things orderly, but he had never thought of himself as a mentor in this way. He'd never imagined he could be the one to guide someone else through their journey. "I don't know," he said hesitantly, though he felt something stir inside him. "I mean, I'm not exactly experienced in this kind of thing. I'm just a cop." She shook her head, cutting him off. "You're not just a cop. You've been through things. You've seen what it's like to help someone when they need it the most. That's what counts." Her words hit him harder than he expected. She was right. It wasn't about the title or the job. It was about the heart, the willingness to show up when it mattered most. He had always believed that kindness, that small moments of compassion, could change the world. Maybe now was his time to put that belief into action, to help someone else make their mark. "I'll help," he said finally, his voice firm with conviction. "I'll help you however I can." Her face lit up with a smile that could have lit up the whole room. "Thank you. You have no idea what this means to me." And in that moment, something shifted within him. James realized that the journey they were about to embark on wasn't just hers. It was theirs. He wasn't just going to stand by and watch her change the world. He was going to help her do it. He was going to be there, not just as a mentor, but as someone who believed in her from the start. The next few months passed in a blur of planning and action. They worked together, tirelessly brainstorming ideas, reaching out to potential supporters, and organizing the first steps of the program. James found himself learning from her as much as she learned from him. She had a way of seeing things, of understanding people, that he had never quite grasped. Her compassion, her drive, her heart, it was contagious. When the program finally launched, it was nothing short of miraculous. Kids who had been forgotten by the system, left to fend for themselves, now had a place to go, a place where they could find support, mentorship, and most importantly, love. James saw the difference it made, not just in their lives, but in his as well. He had never felt so alive, so connected to something bigger than himself. Every success, every small victory, felt like a win for both of them. As they stood together, watching the kids come and go, James turned to her, his heart full. "You did this. You made this happen." She smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "No, we did this. You were there from the start, and I couldn't have done it without you." In that moment, as they stood side by side, looking at the future they had helped build together, James realized that it didn't matter what he had done in the past. It was what they were doing now that counted, and that, more than anything, made him feel proud. As the months passed, the program grew. It wasn't just about giving kids a place to go anymore. It was about giving them a chance to believe in themselves, to realize they weren't alone. James watched as they slowly transformed. He saw kids who had once been quiet, withdrawn, suddenly opening up, finding their voices and sharing their dreams. The program became a sanctuary, a place where they could be more than just their circumstances. James had always believed in the power of second chances, but watching these kids fight for their own chance at life, at a future, made him realize how powerful that belief truly was. He could see it in their eyes, their hunger for something better, their desire to not be defined by their pasts. It wasn't just the kids who were changing, it was the whole community. People were starting to notice. The small acts of kindness, the volunteer work, the efforts to help, they were all adding up. It was becoming something bigger than any of them had imagined. One evening, after another long day at the center, James sat at his desk in the small office they had set up. His fingers tapped lightly on the table as he glanced at the photo on his desk, the one from that first day, the day they'd met again. He couldn't stop thinking about it. That one moment had changed everything, but he couldn't have predicted how much it would change him, too. The door creaked open, and she walked in, her face tired but determined. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice low but steady. "We're making a difference, aren't we?" James looked up at her, a proud smile tugging at his lips. "We are," he said simply, the weight of those words settling between them. It wasn't just the kids' lives they were changing. It was their own, too. This journey had brought them both more than they could have ever expected. She sat down across from him, her eyes softening. "You've always been here for me," she said quietly, "ever since that night. I can't believe how far we've come. How far I've come." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "You've done all the hard work. I've just been along for the ride." Her laugh was soft, filled with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "I don't think I could have done it without you," she said. "You were the one who showed me that it wasn't too late, that I could still be something. And you've been there every step of the way." James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his heart swelling. It was hard for him to accept compliments, to acknowledge that he had made a difference in someone's life. But as he looked at her, he realized something. Maybe it wasn't just about the big moments or the grand gestures. Maybe it was the small things, the words of encouragement, the moments of reassurance, that made the difference. He wasn't just her savior from the past. He was part of her future, and in many ways part of his own too. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. It was the same city that had felt so cold and distant years ago when he'd found her in that dumpster. But now, everything seemed different. He had seen the best of it, the beauty in the people who were willing to change, to make things better. "You know," he said, turning back to her, "I never thought I'd be doing something like this. I didn't think I'd be the one helping, teaching, guiding. I thought I was just here to catch the bad guys, do my job, and go home." She stood up, crossing the room to join him at the window. "And now," he smiled, his eyes softening, "now, I realize it's not just about catching the bad guys. It's about helping people see their worth, helping them realize that they're not defined by their pasts, that they can choose their future." She nodded, her expression full of understanding. "You've always known that, though. I think you just didn't know it at first." He chuckled softly, the sound easy and comfortable between them. "Maybe. But I've learned a lot from you. I've learned that sometimes the hardest part is just believing in yourself." For a moment, they stood there in silence, looking out at the city as it faded into the night. James knew that everything had changed. It wasn't just the kids or the program. It was him, too. He had spent so much time thinking about what he could do, what he could change, and now he knew that the real change had been inside him all along. "So," she said after a pause, breaking the silence with a quiet question, "what now?" James turned to her, his heart full, his mind clear. "Now we keep going. We keep helping. We keep making a difference, one person at a time." Her smile widened, and for the first time in a long while, James felt a deep, unshakable peace. He wasn't just part of something bigger. He was part of something good, something that mattered. And as they both stood there, side by side, they knew the journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning.